Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. Ukraine War news update, third part thereof for the 23rd of February 2023. I don't like giving you too much content. It's just this war spreads its tendrils into world politics so much that it involves so many different actors, so many different nations getting involved. You've got the US, you've got China, you've got this axis of Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, you've got the Middle East, you've got the EU, US politics, internal politics. Then you've got what's going on the front line in terms of the actual war. And then you've got the losses taking place each day. And you have as well the military aid that's being given to Ukraine and developed by Russia, so on and so forth. This is so far ranging that's why there's so much content coming out. Anyway, this geopolitical video has a lot of content to give to you too. We're going to start with Zelensky here. This is the famous "We Are All Here" photo. If you remember, right at the beginning, a fresh-faced Zelensky at the beginning of the war gave you that selfie, gave us that selfie. This is almost the indication of the social media element to this war. Zelensky starting off with that famous photo. Well, actually, has been a photograph that's the "We Are All Here," and I love it. I love the callback here. That's brilliant. And I love the fact that this is now a new "we" in this. It's just brilliant. So whatever you think of Zelensky, says Dmitry from War Translated, you can't deny the ability to continue attracting international support even 2 years since the start of the full-scale invasion, illegal full-scale invasion. And I totally agree. Here is a picture of lots of people. This is a much bigger selfie, if you like. He doesn't have an arm long enough, but he lists all the countries here together with representatives of and all of those countries and organizations as well represented in this photo. I think it's fantastic, and that just goes to show you the stark difference, I think, between Ukraine and Ukraine's support and Russia's support. I don't think you get a photo like that, and that photo you would have would be a little bit more nefarious in my book. Sort of, yeah, this is "We Are All Here," says Putin with a picture of King Jong-un and Ayatollah from Tehran, from Iran, and yeah. Anyway, moving on. The EU Council has approved the 11th sanction. Oh, the reason he said that, sorry, is because we are just on the doorstep of the second anniversary of the war. So this is the beginning of the war, and this is where we're at now, and how things have developed and evolved. Anyway, the EU Council has approved the 13th sanctions package against the Russian regime. Sanctions target the Russian defense industry and individuals associated with it, including those who help secure arms supplies from North Korea. So there's this idea now that we need to start looking at North Korea and Iran much more closely, and there'll be more on Iran later. Also, the new sanctions will limit access of the Russian military-industrial complex to components for the production of drones. Again, it's trying to close those loopholes to stop these parts getting to Russia. The problem is it's so difficult. We talked about this a lot. They're still going to get there. I mean, the silver lining is that those parts will be more expensive through going through all these different entities. So if you directly exported stuff to Russia, say it's in peacetime, I would make this widget. I'd export that to Russia. I'd have a cut in that, and maybe the export company would have a logistics company would have a cut in that, and then Russia would buy that. Okay, now I'm selling it to someone else, who sells it to someone else, who sells it to someone else, to someone else. That's exported across to Kyrgyzstan and sold to someone else there, who then sells it into Russia. Every single element of that chain will be taking a cut. And so Russia will naturally be paying more for the components, but nonetheless, they still get those components. Right. Transnistria will ask Putin to... Sorry, where was I going with that? Yes, so that's the sanctions package. Okay, now moving on to a worrying development, potentially. So Transnistria, which is this breakaway or annexed, sort of quasi-annexed area of Moldova that does have sort of 1,500 Russian troops sort of stuck there. It's a population that has very much been victim to Russia fomenting discord and providing like pure Russian state narrative. So you'll have a brainwashed kind of population in that area that will be somewhat or very pro-Russian. So Transnistria will ask Putin to join Russia, or will it? On February the 28th, for the first time in 18 years, Transnistria will hold a Congress of Deputies of the so-called Pridnestrovian Moldovan Republic, PMR. The opposition believes that at the meeting they will ask Putin to accept them into Russia. Leader of Transnistria, Vadim Krasnoselsky, said he is initiating the Congress because of, quote, pressure from Moldova. The oppositionist Gennady Chorba is sure that they received such an order from Moscow. The very next day, on February the 28th, Putin is scheduled to deliver his address to the Russian Federal Assembly. That would be something he would want to champion in talking to the Federal Assembly, Putin. Right. Moldova's Transnistria may petition Putin to annex it, according to an opposition MP. So this is coming from Euromaidan Press. Ukrainian intelligence does not confirm the report, while Ukraine promises to counter Russian destabilization as EU sanctions pro-Russian local actors. So the EU is getting involved in sanctioning people involved in sowing discord within Transnistria and Moldova. It's all happening there. H.I. Sutton, who's a bit of a naval expert, maritime expert, reports that Transnistria, part of Moldova, may request annexation by Russia, may trigger action from Moldova with Ukraine's help. Russia realistically is unable to intervene, in part because Ukraine has sunk so many of their landing ships in the past 2 years. So it does a bit of a thread here. It's just an example of lots of Russian ship losses. So March the 24th, Russian Navy Alligator-class landing ship Saratov explodes while unloading at Berdyansk in the Sea of Azov, possibly hit by a Ukrainian ballistic missile. 2 Rapucha-class landing ships managed to escape. Then we had August 3rd and 4th, Russian Navy Rapucha-class landing ship Olegnorsky Gonyak struck by Ukrainian SBU maritime drones outside Novorossiysk. Significant damage, towed to Novorossiysk, subsequently repaired. September the 13th, Ukrainians strike on Sevastopol, reportedly with Storm Shadows and Scalps cruise missiles. The Rapucha-class landing ship Minsk and a Kilo-class submarine Rostov-on-Don were seriously damaged in a dry dock, out of service, likely write-offs. And then December the 25th and 6th, Ukraine hits a Rapucha-class landing ship Novocherkassk in Feodosia on Crimea. Ship caught fire, seriously damaged, likely write-off. She sunk at the pier. I mean, that one's a goner. And then February the 14th, we had the Caesar Kunikov, that was struck by drones in the southern coast of Crimea. So these then will stop Russia being able to adequately aid anything that happens in Transnistria if it gets sort of serious. Again, they can't. The problem for Russia is it's completely cut off here. So, trying to get planes landing anywhere near is not going to happen in helicopters, and trying to get ships landing troops around the sort of a desert area to get help to Transnistria is not going to happen. So, whatever takes place there, I guess we're going to be watching with a big magnifying glass, but it's very difficult for Russia to affect much change outside of the information spaces, really. But that might be enough. Right, US and UK reportedly endorsed Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte as the next NATO Secretary General. I was going to play you the analysis of these decisions from various European nations, from Ukraine the latest, but I'm actually going to dip into that podcast twice already. But Francis Farrell, who was at, as I mentioned yesterday, at the Munich Security Conference, was saying that the talk of the conference was that there were 2 female candidates that were the possible candidates, Ursula von der Leyen and Frederiksen from Denmark. They were European nations were saying, we don't think that would be a good choice, because if Trump becomes president in 2024, then it's likely that he will prefer a male to be in charge. And I'm going to just add to this in a second. Actually, if there's a female in charge of NATO, he would see NATO as below him, beneath him, and that would cause a dynamic that would not be to the benefit of NATO. Now, to add to that, apparently Trump quite respects Mark Rutte. So Mark Rutte, as a Dutch leader, he's been prime minister there for 13 years. He's survived. He's called Teflon to some degree, I think, because he survived so many challenges, and he's been in charge of various coalitions during his tenure. He apparently, when Trump, back in Trump's tenure, was I think having a go at some meeting with the EU, having a go at the EU and trade and something like that. Mark Rutte said, "No, you've got it wrong," and basically stood up to him and called him out. And apparently, Trump kind of actually reacted well to that. Trump reacts well to strong people, right? He likes strong people. And if you're going to challenge him, he'd rather he challenge you in a way that keeps you on his side. So I think Mark Rutte challenged him and said, "Look, we are prepared to work with you, blah, 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 blah." And that challenge left Trump respecting Mark Rutte quite a bit. And so the thought is that he is a good person to have in charge of NATO, and he's also got a pretty decent military understanding and background. Like, his CV is good for NATO, right? So he is one of the better candidates for that role, given all of that information. Now, I am going to do a video on my views on if Trump becomes president, what would his view be to Ukraine? I actually think it's a 50-50, but I'll talk about that later. I also want to dip into some of the issues with him getting elected, because actually he is in financial trouble now, big time, and that's a fact, right? And he's got an inability to pay for that. And so I think Trump is in much more trouble than a lot of people give him credit for being. And I just think it's a low probability now of him becoming president, unless something really dodgy happens with Biden, because the economy is looking good. Unless Biden makes some serious gas or has some health issues, which is possible, I just think Trump's going to find it too difficult to get elected. Right, the authorities of Spain did not allow that pilot Kuzminov was in the country. Did not know, sorry. Didn't make sense to me then, because I read it wrong. So this is the Mi-8 pilot who defected, landed in Ukraine. 2 of his co-pilots were shot. He had pre-arranged to defect. Then he's ended up in, I believe, Alicante in Spain. He was then shot by Russian connections, almost certainly. But it turns out the Spanish didn't even know he was there. So that's interesting. We also heard that the Ukrainians didn't want him to go to Spain because it was too dangerous, and lo and behold, this was stated by the Minister of Defense of the country, Margarita Robles. He lived, this is Kuzminov, lived with a Ukrainian passport behind the back of the government of Spain. Quote, Russian pilot Kuzminov, according to the Spanish edition of El Periodico, was killed by 6 shots. So he was well and truly assassinated there. Latvia is to become the first EU country to ban imports of grain from Russia. Latvian President Rinkovic argued that Russian grain imports support the Russian economy and, therefore, its army. A little bit more on Russian grain soon. Polish authorities intend to take under special control, this is a quote, the sections of the roads leading to the checkpoints on the border with Ukraine, and to completely unblock the movement of military and humanitarian aid, according to Donald Tusk, which is good news because these issues are still ongoing. Anton Gerashchenko talks about, in Poland, unidentified people poured Ukrainian agricultural products, I believe this is rapeseed, on the ground at Dorohusk station, according to the Minister of Infrastructure of Ukraine, Kubrikov. 3 grain trucks with rapeseed were opened. This is a transit cargo that was headed to Germany. Only Russia will benefit from such actions. Yeah, it's terrible. It's just a waste. And what annoys Ukrainians is that they have gone to extreme lengths to farm their lands, right, in many places where it's super dangerous. Farmers are dying, mines are exploding. It's just it's a real trial and tribulation to get this foodstuff processed, and then put it into the logistic chains, and then to see it poured out on the railways and on the roads is just a real kick in the teeth. Just, yeah, I get that. Right, here we have a poll that came out the other day. Actually, I haven't yet talked about this. Barely 10% of Europeans believe Ukraine can still defeat Russia, finds a poll. So support for Ukraine among Europeans remains broad, but nearly 2 years after a full-scale invasion, barely 10% now believe it can defeat Russia, according to an EU-wide survey, with some form of compromise settlement seen as a most likely endpoint. This isn't kind of what people want to happen, but it's what people think is likely to happen. This is kind of looking at the last few months, particularly a very difficult situation for Ukraine, and probably that proximity bias giving some sense of a degree of hopelessness for the Ukrainians. Ukraine the latest talked a little bit about this on their podcast.
Point towards some polling that was done by the European Council on Foreign Relations, which is a Berlin-based think tank, that has basically found, it's done a very widespread poll, that only 10% of people it asked believe that Kyiv can actually win the war. And almost 4 times that number must think that Ukraine must accept a compromise settlement without regaining all the territory lost since the full-scale Russian invasion. So that is a fairly lengthy poll. It's surveyed 17,023 people across Austria, France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Italy, Netherlands, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Spain, and Sweden. But yeah, and it's really terrifying reading, because there's obviously some people support Ukraine more than others, but have the politicians failed to get across that they can deliver, one, on that promise that they've been making to help Ukraine win the war, or at least come out with a very satisfactory outcome? And two, have they just not been selling it to the public that well? Have they not?
It's a really good point here. So people don't wake up in the morning with opinions that have just been randomly formulated in their dream fevers while being asleep. Like, people's opinions are derived from what they are told, from the narrative that they have generated from the information spaces they live in. Right, so you guys watching this will have many of your opinions formed by me in some way. Like, if you watch a lot of my content, then my ideas will seep into your heads, and you'll end up speaking to people at the water cooler and coming out with something that I've told you, right? And some of you will take on board what I've said, and then look at opinions that are different to mine, and then form an opinion somewhere in the middle, or whatever your situation is. But the idea is that we don't just make stuff up. Okay, our opinions are emerge from who we are and where we're sat. So when you are getting these poll results from European nations that say only 10% believe that Ukraine can win the war, that will be derived from, broadly speaking, because most people don't sit around watching Ukraine news channel, Ukraine geopolitical channels like mine. That'll be derived from mainstream media and from discussions with people around the water cooler, right? And so this is how important you guys are for disseminating information that you think is more accurate than what other people might get. And hopefully my job is to try and make sure that all my information is as accurate as possible, so that we have this chain of accountability in what we say to people. But the mainstream media, I think, has done a bad job of keeping Ukraine in the news, and it's done a quite bad job of correctly reporting important context. So when you get, for example, New York Times reporting that, oh, it's all terrible in Krinky and the soldiers feel like they're just going on suicide missions, that's to not report the context, which is the Russians have been absolutely hammered around there. They've lost way more, and equipment has been destroyed left, right, and centre. Now, those soldiers won't necessarily know why they're there, but the larger context is that they're there, in my opinion, would be to fix and attract and fix Russian forces and equipment in the area so they can be hammered by artillery and drones. Okay, and that has been somewhat successful, but those troops won't necessarily know that. So the New York Times comes in and is unable to speak to Russian troops, so there's a selection bias there, and only speaks to Ukrainian troops, and the Ukrainian troops are going to moan because that's what troops do, and it's also pretty horrible to be used as bait for those Russian degradation tactics. Then you are going to get a one-sided sense of what's going on, and if you're not a critical journalist and you want that clickbait title and clickbait content, then you're going to produce a kind of doom and gloom article. Now, if that's generally like reflective of some of the mainstream media approaches to this war, then people in the European nations might be reading media and watching media that's painting a picture that shows that it's all desperate and it's all going to go wrong for Ukraine. And there is that out there, especially when we've had 4 months of almost 5 months of no aid, no real aid from the US. So there are elements of like, yeah, it is pretty terrible, but is it always going to be terrible? What the long-term prospects for Ukraine, and are we getting a proper sense of the long-term prospects for Ukraine from mainstream media? And so there is, I think, a good case to suggest that people being asked questions about whether Ukraine can prevail in this war might not have a very good picture of really what the reality of it is. It's not to say that it ain't going to be super, super tough. But yeah,
Not been sort of explaining why we are supporting Ukraine. The Eastern Europeans are very good at it. If you look to the Baltic states, the Poles, they say because it's an existential security threat if we allow Russia to steamroll through Ukraine. And what we're doing by supplying Ukraine, we are basically helping guarantee our security by tying up Russian forces for a long time to come. And this doesn't seem to, the attitudes of now the people doesn't seem to correlate with some of the messages. And I think the governments have slightly been losing track of how they can win over the people. So, for instance, looking a deeper dive into the poll, one of the points was if the US cuts aid to Ukraine, should the EU step up aid? Only 20% of people, respondents, said yes. 80% of those said no or don't know. 10% of people said Ukrainian victory is more likely. 20% of people said Russian victory was more likely. Sorry to get those confused. And then you've got from Romania, Italy, Greece, and Hungary, 50% or more of respondents in those countries support Ukraine negotiating a peace deal with Russia. So I guess it's on one hand going to become equally hard for governments in those countries to support Ukraine on and on. Not that they all do. So the Italians are pretty good. The Greeks aren't fantastic, but they've been helping behind the scenes. We know about the Hungarians. If their publics don't sort of believe in it as much. So I guess the messaging, and 2 years on, more fatigue sets in, really need to set out why we're helping Ukraine and what exactly we're doing is benefiting in what way. And I'll stop there, Roland.
I thought that's a pretty interesting analysis. I hadn't seen this part yet. A new Trump presidency. Would you be more pleased or disappointed if Donald Trump were elected as the next US president? Very disappointed is in dark red. And you can see Sweden, Germany, Netherlands, Portugal, Austria, Spain, and France are basically, very disappointed or disappointed, fairly disappointed. But interesting looking down, Hungary, obviously the least. They most want Trump to be president, and there's a lot of activity at CPAC and Trump himself being involved with Tucker Carlson. We've seen involved with Hungary and the Conservative Conference being in Budapest twice. So there's no surprise there. Romania and Poland to a degree as well. So, and Greece a little bit too. So interesting. I love data like this. It tells very interesting stories. Just when you look at data like this and just think, oh, that's just lines on a infographic. Actually, every single one of these results tells you a story. Like Hungary's relationship with the GOP, with the Republicans in the US, is responsible for a large amount of this data there. And Sweden, you can say something about, say, Germany and Merkel's relationship with Trump might be responsible for Germany being up there. So anyway, move on. Armenia has frozen the country's participation in the Collective Security Treaty Organization. So that's not OSCE. That's the CSTO, which is kind of like the Russian NATO. And Armenia said, So Armenia is yet again pushing back against Russian influence. This is Russia losing in that sphere of influence directly bordering the Russian Federation. So Prime Minister Pashinyan said in an interview with France 24, citing unfulfilled terms of the treaty concerning the country. And then Hungarian First Minister visits Iran. So this is so challenging this. And again, look at Hungary and where they are, both there and Hungary and Greece down here, which is the outcome of Russia's war in Ukraine. Many more thinking Russia's going to win, far fewer thinking Ukraine will win, so on and so forth. And then Hungary's getting into bed with China at the moment, much closer trade relationship with China, but also here with Iran, signing a trade deal with Iran. Hungary, and this is someone in the EU, a country in the EU, going out there to do bilateral agreements with enemies, if you like, of the EU or nations that need to be held at arm's length until certain things are resolved. Hungary's just going straight in there. Met his Iranian counterpart, signed a trade deal on agriculture and food industry. And then here we have Moscow is increasingly involved in Africa. Burkina Faso confirmed receiving 25,000 tons of wheat from the Russian Federation. Local sources also reported the arrival of the Russian unit of 100 members, with 200 more expected. I've got a really cool bit. I'm going to dip back into that Ukraine the Latest podcast. There's a really good section on this that you have to listen to. The Russian Federation's aid is being compared to Western inaction in assisting Burkina Faso, where 3.5 million people need food. The Kremlin understands the importance of bringing in more African countries, and the power will increase, along with the provision of military advisors and possibly fighters. The Russian units reformatted from the Wagner Group have direct state support, as they are now under the leadership of the GRU Major General Andrei Averyanov. Averyanov leads the covert operations unit in the GRU, which carries out missions on foreign soil. The Russian Federation's military intelligence, in cooperation with the Deputy Defense Minister Yevkurov, is actively engaged in strengthening Russia's partnership with Africa. So let's go and dip into that. So this is that same Ukraine the Latest podcast from 2 days ago from the Daily Telegraph. And this is speaking to an expert, I think from RUSI, from the Royal United Services Institute. It's Jack Watling, actually. This is what he had. That's a UK military think tank.
Well, let's talk about Africa, because, of course, the line that's really caught the eyes of my fellow journalists, really, across the media, is this concept. You say that the GRU are referring to this in there. Tell me if I've got this right, referring to it in their own internal documents, or referring to it jokingly as the regime survival package. Could you tell us about the regime survival package, what it is, how much it costs, and what you get for your
important
money?
Yeah, sure. So the Russians looked at, basically, they don't want to be isolated from sanctions. They also don't want countries that control critical minerals to be close to the West. Many of these countries are in the Middle East and Africa. And so they wanted to devise a strategy for flipping these countries' alignment, basically. And the pitch that they made to the elites in these countries was, firstly, the West essentially tells you what to do. And yes, it's prepared to come and fight people in your country, but it fights the people it wants to fight. It doesn't give you the power to formulate your own sovereign choices. Whereas what we will do is we will provide you with troops, and they will respond to your targeting priorities, essentially. Of course, if we do that, and we use Russian counter-partisan methods, which are fairly brutal, the West is going to leave, the UN is going to get upset, the Security Council might try and pass resolutions, although we'll protect you there, and they might try and economically push back on you. But what we can do is we can offer you propaganda support so that you can sell the policy to your own population. We can give you diplomatic protection internationally. And in terms of how you pay for it, we can get you out of the vulnerability of debt by you essentially offering mining concessions and concessions of natural resources to Russian companies. We will then continue to pay tax to you, but the profits underpin the operational costs of what we're doing. And so you essentially get a military capability for free. because that money would have been going to Western companies if it wasn't coming to us anyway. And so this is quite an attractive offer because it gives the countries that in many cases feel like they've been neglected by the West, particularly in the last couple of years, where the
Remember, there are a number of countries in that Sahel region of Africa and elsewhere that have been, borne the brunt of colonialism and neo-colonialism. And you've got, say, for example, France has been involved in many countries in a very extractive way, like being there militarily and diplomatically, but extracting kind of raw minerals, natural resources and money out of the country without really giving all that much back. And that is, I think, something that many countries have had to deal with and then are looking for alternatives to that. And Russia are presenting themselves as that alternative.
Priority has very much been on European security, that they are regaining the power of choice and assuring regime survival. The problem is, and the Russians recognize this in their own discourse, is that it's essentially a colonial project because they are also making these countries dependent upon themselves and isolating them from other potential partners.
So Russia then becomes the new colonizer, right? It's just saying, oh, we're a great alternative to, say, for example, France. You need to shake off, break the shackles of French colonial history. Yep, okay, and now we'll come along and we'll provide all this for you and extract natural resources from you and et cetera, et cetera. So there's this, arguably, this kind of neo-colonialism going on from Russia as well.
And once they do that, then they have a huge amount of power and leverage in those countries.
You mentioned Sudan. Just for clarity, for our listeners, there was a civil war in Sudan between the Rapid Support Forces, headed by a guy called Hemeti, and the regular army. Chuck, could you just clarify which side Russia is trying to win that war for?
The RSF.
For the RSF. And I mean, I suppose the next logical question is, there's a number of next logical questions. One is, we're right to think that the Russians aren't looking at Africa as an isolated thing. This is part of one of the points you make in the reports. They're looking at this as an expansion of the theatre of confrontation beyond Ukraine.
Yes, which is very consistent with their methodologies during the Cold War, right? Where they realized that if they distracted the West, if they set fires elsewhere, then they could move policy attention away from the core issue. And so this is aligned with an attempt to try and exacerbate the sense of threat and alarm, while also moving that threat away from a solution, which is to arm and support Ukraine, right? Because if they ramp up the threat in a way that it encourages continued arm and support for Ukraine, then they expand the problem that they have. Whereas if they can break the relationship with Ukraine by shifting Western attention elsewhere, then this assists their main effort, which is still the subjugation of Ukraine.
You describe, in Africa,
which is really important. So what happened in the Middle East, or with regard to Israel and Gaza and then the Houthis, is that was an opportunist scenario. Russia didn't plan on that happening, I don't think, but they were particularly happy it did happen. Putin was laughing all the way to his palace when all this took off and then distracted everyone from helping Ukraine. And it's the same with what's going on in Africa to a certain degree and elsewhere in the world. All of this other stuff that goes on that confuses the world or distracts the world away from Ukraine is to the benefit of Russia, and they can achieve their primary goals in Ukraine. Sorry.
Quite a well thought out thing, and this restructuring of the operational kind of support network in Europe as well. I suppose in Africa and in Europe. Is anybody contesting this? Is this another case of the West? I don't know, maybe the West has taken a lot of stick, right, throughout the Ukraine war, throughout the crisis, for waking up to things a bit late and not responding. Do you think, from your own research, from the conversations you've had with people, that Western governments are alive to this threat? Are they responding? Are the Russians being contested in this space in Africa? Or at the moment, do they have more or less a free hand?
I think if you look at the number of arrests and expulsions of Russian agents that have happened over the last couple of years in Europe, arrests in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Sweden, all over the place, in the UK, It's evident when you start seeing spies being arrested, it's not evidence that there's a terrible problem of penetration. It's usually evidence that the system is fighting back. And in that sense, yes, there is an effort to contest. The Moldovan attempts failed, or the Russian attempts to destabilize Moldova failed, partly because of warning and therefore the ability of the Moldovan state to react and to disrupt what the Russians were planning on doing. So there is an attempt to push back in some areas. However, we have a system of government, which I think has become more and more like this over the course of the war on terror, which thinks at relatively small scale and becomes quite myopically focused on single issues. And really that's driven by an inability to delegate, an inability to empower people to have authority without reference back to deal with a problem and make decisions. When you have decisions that are very, very centralized, there is simply a bottleneck on how many decisions that can be made by the small number of people that are empowered to make them. And so what that leads to is, yes, not much of a policy response when it comes to Sudan or Mali and so on. And, the collapse of a policy over 10 years of operating in Mali to try and bring peace to that country has now completely collapsed, and it's barely registered in the news here. The day the coup happened in Mali, there were maybe 2 days of coverage. But the fact that 10 years of effort has been completely wiped out, it has barely registered. And that's a good example of where it's quite interesting, because a lot of our strategic documents in the West talk about the need to compete, but we're not really competing, right? We are ruthlessly prioritizing where we actually invest our time and resource.
And it doesn't seem to be in Africa enough, I think, is a general idea there. Right, we'll leave that. I thought there's excellent, so much more in there. And it actually starts with, it's well worth listening to the whole thing. It starts with what's going on in the Balkans, in Eastern Europe with regard to Russian influence there. And then goes on to talk, as you can see, about Africa. Now, this is, talking about information war, as I did an awful lot yesterday. Talked about, what's going on in the US and the purchase that Russian narrative has on so many people in the US, whether it be people who are overtly political, lawmakers, or people like Elon Musk. It is really frightening. And this is Elon Musk then jumping on the Hunter Biden thing. And Lev Parnas, who was one of the main guys involved in trying to dig up dirt on Hunter Biden on instruction from Rudy Giuliani, has now called Elon Musk out. So Michael Weiss here says, just remarkable. So Elon Musk says corrupting Ukraine certainly is. So he's got involved in saying that corruption in Ukraine and corrupting Ukraine is part of what US government has done, or whatever. He said, Lev Parnas has said, as a Ukrainian who was employed by Republicans to do that, he said Elon Musk stopped spreading Russian propaganda. Hunter Biden did not corrupt Ukraine. If you really want to learn the truth about what actually happened in Ukraine, I would be more than happy to have a conversation with you, and I will bring the receipts. Hashtag Lev remembers. It's just, we've got to be so wary about so much of what is being utilized for partisan advantage in the US, and just try and unpick it and say, well, how much of this is actually true? Like, we want it to be true because I'm of this party, but actually how much is true, and how much is being fed by Russian agents and Russian information campaigns? It may be very useful for me to be out there, but actually, is it true? And when someone like Elon Musk is parroting stuff that has effectively been implanted by Russian intelligence agents, that's not cool, because he has huge reach. And we just need to get back to this point of, like, we need to get to a point of just massive support for Ukraine, and stuff like jumping on the Hunter Biden bandwagon is probably not helping. Now, I'm not defending Hunter Biden. I think he's quite a problematic person with a huge amount of baggage, and he needs to be called out on that. But the idea that Joe Biden's involved in some kind of corruption thing through Ukraine is a bit that's not true. And I think that we just need to call out people like Elon Musk when they're parroting things that are incredibly dubious. Anyway, getting onto US issues here, and I know I've spent several days on this, but then it just keeps coming up, and it's massively in the news at the moment. The idea that there is that purchase of Russian information and disinformation in US political discourse is a worry. So Russian pundits are rejoicing about a window of opportunity in Ukraine due to issues with US aid. They ponder, so this is what the propagandists are saying on TV. They ponder whether Russia will go all the way to Washington and say they want their enemies to be tormented as they try to figure out where Russia will stop. So the Russian propagandists are taking this and running with this lack of US aid and saying, we can take advantage of this and we can go all the way to Washington type thing. I mean, obviously ridiculous, but that's what's going on. Now, I'm going to give some huge props to Fox News here, which is very unusual for me. And I don't know how much of this is Fox News trolling Tucker Carlson. So we know that Fox News got rid of Tucker Carlson because of all the leaks that came out and the liability they had. In fact, they ended up settling out of court with Dominion. And I don't know what's going on with Smartmatic, but the whole election fraud thing came to an end for Fox because they were challenging court, and they were going to lose in court, and they settled out of court to the tune of whatever it was, $800 million with Dominion. And we know Tucker Carlson knew that it was a load of rubbish and admitted in his WhatsApps and emails and whatnot that he knew it was rubbish but was going for it anyway, type thing. And so they got rid of Tucker Carlson and he went his own way. And now on his own for Elon Musk, so he's got a show on Twitter. So Elon Musk is effectively his boss, if you like. Tucker Carlson had a show on Twitter and then has gone to Russia to interview Putin. And he's interviewed Putin as a lapdog of Putin in Moscow, in this comfortable environment where he gives Putin an hour to give everyone a kind of propaganda history lesson from Putin's point of view, and then goes about going to Russian supermarkets and fawning over them, and then going to Russian subway stations and fawning over them. And then Fox News has looked at this and said, I think they've said, screw you, Tucker, we're going to do some real journalism here. So Tucker's saying, I'm an independent journalist. Fox News has sent their journalists to speak to Zelensky freaking on the front line, right? And Zelensky, this is brilliant from Zelensky and it's brilliant from Fox News, which is, this is real journalism. This is what it looks like. And we're not going to be walking around lovely subway stations and then talking to Putin in his lovely ornate room or whatever. We're going to speak to Zelensky pretty much on the front line. And this is going to be primetime, decent journalism. So Fox News counters Tucker's bunker interview with a dictator by interviewing President Zelensky on the front lines in Ukraine, being less than 1.5 miles from Russian positions. Zelensky talks about the anniversary of the war, the debate in Congress on aid to Ukraine, and the retreat of Ukrainian troops from Avdiivka. I believe, is this going out? Did it go out last night? I haven't actually seen the interview, or is it going out tonight? The Zelensky's press secretary has showed a backstage of the interview on to Fox News. It was filmed several kilometers from the front line. A local cat also came to listen to the interview. So I thought this was pretty cool here, and just gives you an indication of what's really happening. So you got a shell hole in the roof. You've got a grotty frontline position. You've got a cat playing with his mic lead, crawling around. I think it's just good stuff here. I'll turn the sound off anyway. And this is just real, real proper journalism where you're speaking to someone, I assume probably challenging him a little bit. Maybe giving him a bit of heat or getting him to talk about the war properly rather than give a pseudo-historical lesson on, or pseudo-history lesson. This is good stuff from Fox, and I think that's a really good kind of corrective to the Tucker Carlson. Now, we're coming up to 2-year anniversary of the war, and it's great to see here the London Evening Standard publishing a special issue for the second anniversary of Russia's war in Ukraine. With a real front page spread there, Ukraine defiant 2 years on. I think keeping it in the news is so important. We talked about that with regard to the polling earlier. Now, this is so interesting for me. So we've got Putin saying to a reporter, for Russia, Biden's victory in the US elections is more preferable. I think this is exceptionally clever, or is it exceptionally obvious double bluffing? So what this will do is get Americans who go, right, well, screw that. I don't want this to be to the benefit of Russia. I'm going to go and vote for, who am I going to vote for if it's not Biden? Trump. This is an attempt to actually get people, in my opinion, to vote for Trump rather than for Biden, because Trump is more beneficial to Putin, as according to every other analyst outside of Russia. He's saying, oh, Biden's really good for Russia. So that, it gets people to vote Trump. Let me know what you think about that. So the White House is saying that the US is to impose sanctions on Iran and that they will go further if ballistic missiles are sent to Russia. Well, the idea is that they've already been sent, is a claim from the Iranians themselves, actually. US will impose new sanctions against Iran over its military cooperation with Russia in the coming days and is, quote, prepared to go further if Iran sells ballistic missiles to Moscow. According to John Kirby, Reuters reported yesterday, 2 days ago, citing multiple sources, that Iran had already sent 400 ballistic missiles to Russia. Kirby said the US has not yet seen any confirmation of the delivery, but warned that if Iran proceeds with the provision, there would be swift and severe response. Good, and I hope they're held to that. I hope he keeps to his word. The US keeps to that word. There is talk about this discharge petition. So, a discharge petition is where, if I understand it, if another bill comes to the floor, you can actually get you can get another bill put forward or something if you get enough signatures. So coming soon, Democrats will introduce a discharge petition to bring Ukraine funding to the House floor. So force it to the floor if your man Mike Johnson refuses to bring the bill to the floor. It seems really bizarre that one person can have that much power over what is debated and what policies and what bills are enacted or enforced in US Congress. It just seems incredible. But anyway, this is Bill Pascrell Jr. saying, I will be on the line to sign it. The votes are there. Are there a dozen Republicans who with a shred of courage to sign it and help Ukraine survive? Stay tuned. So maybe I'll do a little bit of prepping on discharge petitions. But he says he needs just 10 to 15 Republicans to stand with Democrats on Ukraine aid. Well, it's already thought that those numbers are there if the bill was even presented by Mike Johnson, and that's why Mike Johnson is not presenting it, because then it would get passed and he would be ousted, as he'll be vacated, because the MAGA Republicans would vacate him for doing so, or for allowing that to happen. US cracks down on sanctioned Russian oligarchs as well. So the enforcement actions coincide with the US announcing new sanctions against Russia on the eve of the second anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion to Ukraine. We'll see what that leads to, what kind of sanctions will happen. White House has announced plans to sanction Iran, as we've heard. And the final thing I'm going to leave you with, and this to me is insanely worrying. This has apparently come from CPAC, which is a conservative conference. As someone says, Democrats should put this clip on every single 2024 ad. This person's statements have been promoted by Trump multiple times. So this is a person who is popular with Trump saying this. Just listen to this.
All right, welcome. I just wanted to say, welcome to the end of democracy. We're here to overthrow it completely. We didn't get all the way there on January 6th, but we will endeavor to get rid of it and replace it with this right here. We'll replace it with this right here.
Amen.
So he's getting an amen for saying, we didn't quite get rid of democracy on January the 6th. We are here to replace democracy. What the flippity gibbets? What the flippity gibbets? Openly saying at a political conference that this is the end of democracy. We want to finish the job we started at January the 6th. And you're going to replace it. I'm not quite sure what he's replacing it with. Dictatorship? I am so afraid at some of the views of people in so many countries at the moment. Some of the political views coming out from actual, either lawmakers or prominent political voices. That's scary. That really scares me. Anyway, let me know what you think. This has been a very long one again. Too much to talk about. Take care. Speak soon.